The best Fantastic Four movie? What if the Fantastic Four's powers awakened their deepest human fears? Victor Doom's fragile ego, Ben's struggle with rejection, and Reed Richards facing his desperate need for control. Discover the raw humanity beneath the suits. Two scientists, Reed Richards and Ben Grimm, arrive at Victor Von Doom's tower to present a project and secure funding. Reed explains his theory about a cosmic storm that will soon pass near Earth and how he wants to study it in space to achieve medical and scientific breakthroughs. But before he can finish his presentation, Doom interrupts him. He reminds Reed that he's always tried to steal the spotlight and then shows him a magazine announcing that Reed is bankrupt. At that moment, Sue Storm enters, the head of genetics at Von Doom Industries and Reed's ex-girlfriend. Her cold greeting makes it clear that things between them didn't end well.
After mocking Reed, Victor offers him a very unfair deal for the project, but Reed accepts because he desperately needs the funding. The pilot for the mission will be Johnny Storm, Sue's brother, a charismatic, womanizing man who was expelled from NASA for indiscipline. Ben knows him well because he was his former commander and is aware that Johnny is arrogant, egotistical, and constantly joking around. Hours before liftoff, Ben looks at a photo of his girlfriend, Debbie, until Johnny interrupts him. Sue hands Ben his special suit, and when Reed sees her wearing hers, he's left speechless. Once he wipes the drool off, he mentions that he helped design the material and makes a technical remark, which sparks a brief moment of interest in Sue, though she quickly hides it.
Already in space, preparations begin, while Doom doesn't stop throwing passive-aggressive comments at Reed and Ben. Ben gets ready to go outside, and Johnny assists him. Meanwhile, Doom takes Sue to a private chamber, opens some panels showing the Earth, and proposes to her, but she hesitates. Before he can finish, Reed interrupts them, alarmed as the cosmic storm has arrived earlier than expected. Everyone tries to help Ben get back to the ship, but they don't make it in time, and the storm strikes them all without their knowing. This will be the beginning of a total transformation in their lives. For some, like Johnny, it will be favorable. For others, like Ben, not so much. And for one, specifically Victor, it will mark the start of his descent into the path of self-destruction.
And I'd like to start by talking about the last one, Victor Doom. From the information we've been given so far, it's clear that behind the facade of the great millionaire magnate, there's someone deeply insecure, someone who feels small, and to compensate, has built a grand, imposing image for the world to see. All that power and that appearance are nothing more than an attempt to cover a very fragile self. The story shows us that the rivalry between Doom and Reed owes back to their university days. At that time, Victor probably felt less than Reed, less brilliant, less charismatic, and less capable. That wound may have pushed him to shield himself and rise above his shortcomings. And in what ways has this sense of inferiority shown itself? Well, Victor has always considered Reed a smarter man, more capable in the scientific field, more likable, and it likely also bothered him to see that Reed had a close, meaningful relationship with Sue. One piece of evidence supporting this idea is when Victor mentioned that Reed has always been very intelligent, and the good thing for him was that Reed hadn't realized it, because that way he could continue taking advantage of him. As I suggested earlier, that envy and sense of inferiority likely motivated Doom to do everything he did, which essentially was to become what he believed made him superior to Reed. That is, building a massive company to project the image of a successful man, amassing millions to outcompete him economically and also place himself in a power hierarchy where Reed ends up working under him. That's why he can afford to belittle him and mock his bankruptcy in the magazine scene, making it clear that he is now above him and, in a way, also won by ending up with the woman Reed had been with. The ironic part is that it wasn't a triumph of seduction, but rather the result of a power dynamic. He keeps her close through their work connection, and this says more about his insecurity than any genuine desire to win her over. Deep down, he seems to feel incapable of winning her over for who he truly is, so he seeks to secure her presence by other means, even if they are less genuine. All of these things, his image as a successful man, his position of power, his wealth, and having ended up with Reed's former partner, Victor uses to prop up his self-esteem. In his mind, his worth lies in what he has, not in who he is. Beyond those external conquests, he feels empty. Up to this point, one could say that within that imaginary rivalry he's carried with Reed since college, Doom believes he has come out victorious. He has more money, more prestige. He has Reed working for him. And on top of that, he ended up with the woman Reed loved. Everything seems to tip the scales in his favor, but very soon, all of that is going to wobble. The next day, they wake up in the hospital. Johnny plays a prank on Ben, telling him his face is beyond repair, but when Ben looks in the mirror, he sees he's fine. Reed notices gray streaks appearing at his temples, and when he sees Sue unconscious, he makes sure everything is fine for her. He even asks a nurse to leave sunflowers, her favorite flowers, by her bed. When Sue wakes up and sees them, she smiles. Victor wakes up healthy, but news of the mission's failure sends his company's stock plummeting, and the bank gives him an ultimatum. If he doesn't turn things around in a week, they'll cut him off. As hours pass, strange symptoms begin to show. A nurse checks Johnny's temperature and tells him he's burning up. He jokes that it's because she's still wearing clothes. Later, he invites her skiing, but on the slopes, his body bursts into flames, launching him into the air like a rocket, melting everything around him, including his clothes. In a conversation, Ben tells Reed that he's noticed he still has feelings for Sue and encourages him to try to win her back. However, Reed replies that she's already with Doom, a brilliant, powerful, and successful man. The three of them spend some time together and enjoy each other's company until Ben starts to feel unwell and heads back to his room. Sue takes the opportunity to tell Reed she has a date with Victor. Reed says he's happy to see them together, but this annoys Sue, who reminds him that 2 years have passed and that's all he has to say. She tells him that at least Victor fights for what he wants and that with him, she feels desired, seen, and valued. Before the argument can escalate, Sue notices she's starting to turn invisible. She drops a bottle, which Reed catches, only for both of them to realize, to their shock, that his arm has stretched like rubber. At that moment, Johnny walks in stark naked to announce that strange things are happening to him too. The second to last to be affected is Victor, who, when approaching metal objects, triggers strange anomalies around them and also begins to lose his hair. The scar on Victor's face and the loss of his hair are the first visible traces of the transformation left by the cosmic storm. However, they can also be interpreted as narcissistic wounds, symbolic marks of a fragile ego beginning to crack under the threat of losing everything that gave him the illusion of being above everyone else. When someone with strong narcissistic traits like Victor perceives a threat, it almost always has to do with feeling less important, weak, or imperfect. That is exactly what he is beginning to experience. The image of the brilliant businessman begins to falter after the failed mission. His millionaire status is at risk because his company might lose its funding. And to top it off, Sue, albeit subtly, practically rejects his marriage proposal during the trip. Throughout the story, these wounds will only deepen. Each blow to his self-esteem will be like a new crack in his narcissistic armor, and that internal collapse will begin to manifest outward. The scars spreading across his skin serve as a metaphor for what's happening inside him. And when someone with this kind of personality feels cornered, their reaction is often extreme and aggressive, especially toward the person who triggers that feeling of smallness. In Victor's case, Reed becomes the target. Doom will react impulsively without considering the consequences, just to silence those feelings he finds unbearable. The last one to change is Ben. When they don't see him around, his friends head to his room, speculating that the cosmic energy may have altered his DNA. Growing increasingly unwell, Ben fully transforms and smashes through the wall to escape. Reed stretches his body to force the door open, but when they enter, Ben is already gone. Only a photo of him with his partner remains. At that moment, Victor arrives. Sue begins to explain what's happening, but he cuts her off and tells them to find Ben before leaving. Meanwhile, Ben manages to make his way across the entire city to his girlfriend's house. Instead of going inside, he calls her out to the street. She notices that Ben's figure is now larger and oddly shaped. He's wearing a coat to cover his body, a hat pulled low over his head, and hides behind some bushes. He reminds her of the promise they made long ago, together forever, no matter what. But when Ben steps out from the bushes and reveals his face, she screams in horror. Ben tries to reassure her, telling her he's still the same person, but she runs away. Now, Ben has become a creature with a body and face of orange stone, the result of the cosmic energy. Ben's girlfriend's reaction hits him hard. He climbs up to the Brooklyn Bridge to think. There, he encounters a man about to jump. Startled, Ben steps back, falls among the cars, and almost gets hit by a truck. Using his new strength, he stops the vehicle with his body, causing a chain reaction crash. Johnny, Sue, and Reed happen to be passing by. Seeing their friend like this shocks them. While Ben helps the driver, the police mistake him for an attacker and aim their weapons. Then, gas tanks from an overturned car explode, putting everyone in danger and flipping a fire truck. Johnny shields a little girl with his body and survives thanks to his fire immunity. Sue discovers she can create energy fields to contain the flames, while Reed uses his elasticity to save a firefighter on the verge of falling. Reporters arrive to cover the event, and citizens who witnessed Ben's heroic act applaud him. This makes the police realize that he was the one who saved the day, and they lower their weapons. At that moment, Ben spots his girlfriend emerging from the crowd. Thinking they can talk and fix things, he approaches, but her body language shows rejection. She then removes her engagement ring, drops it on the ground, and simply walks away without a word or closure. Though Ben's body is made of stone, his heart still beats, and in that moment, he feels immense pain. What happened to Ben after his heart was broken shows something I've mentioned in different videos. The way we see ourselves is deeply shaped by how others perceive us.
When someone experiences rejection or mistreatment from people important to them, like in this case their own partner, it's very hard for those wounds not to cut deep.
Little by little, one begins to see the world through those other eyes and ends up believing those judgments, eventually convincing oneself that they no longer deserve acceptance or love. Breaking free from those perceptions is by no means easy. It requires inner work to gain some distance and rely on something like a reality check, reevaluating who you are, what you've done, and remembering that your worth is not defined by an appearance or a single trait. At first, when this happens, the experience can feel devastating, especially because sometimes the people closest to you, even those you love, drift away. Over time, though, it becomes clear that those bonds weren't real and couldn't last in the long run. If a relationship depends solely on something external, like beauty, money, or social status, it's actually a very fragile and unfulfilling connection. Reed, who watched everything from a distance, helps Ben pick up the ring and promises to do everything he can to restore him to his human form. As they catch their breath, a police officer shows them that the whole country is talking about them, and the press is already calling them the Fantastic Four. Johnny loves this and steps out to pose for the cameras. His friends follow, and reporters bombard them with questions. Reed explains that they still don't fully understand what happened, only that some unknown energy altered their DNA and that they need to be careful. Johnny, on the other hand, calls them superpowers and announces that the era of the Fantastic Four has just begun. Meanwhile, Victor's assistant tells Doom that Larry King has canceled the interview he had planned to boost confidence in his company because the news about the Fantastic Four has now taken all the attention. This also causes problems with the bankers, who are unhappy with the image this scandal will bring to the company, and they deliver devastating news. They will no longer fund his business. When the Fantastic Four arrive at Reed's apartment, they are greeted like celebrities. Stanley, disguised as a mailman, hands them a stack of overdue payment notices. The elevator gets stuck because of Ben, who, embarrassed, climbs the stairs. Upstairs, Reed shows them his penthouse, a laboratory where they can stay while investigating their changes, and assigns them rooms. In her room, Sue finds a diary with photos of both of them from college, which moves her.
At that moment, Victor enters the room, having come from his office to take Sue home and have her checked by doctors. However, Sue prefers to stay at Reed's place with her brother.
Reed greets Victor, who tells him, "We're in this together and I can help you with whatever you need," before leaving. Reed follows him and says he's sorry for the mission's failure. Victor begins to grow furious, replying that it wasn't just a simple failure, it was a disaster that ruined the lives of 4 people. Reed tries to explain that he called to abort the mission, but Victor, now enraged, reminds him that he put in his money, his name, and his company, and he won't allow himself to be made to look like a fool. The lights flicker from his anger, and when he steps into the elevator and punches it in a fit of rage, he discovers he has enormous strength, and that beneath his skin, a metallic layer is starting to form. As I mentioned earlier, Victor Doom's fragile sense of self felt deeply threatened by Reed, and that threat became the focus of his hostility. In this scene, we also saw the first glint of metal beneath his skin, a clear sign that the transformation had already begun. And I find it very telling that his path to becoming the villain we know as Doom didn't happen all at once, but rather little by little.
His body begins to reflect what is happening in his inner world. This second layer of metallic skin that emerged serves as a metaphor for how the resentment and hatred toward Reed slowly consumed him, increasingly invading his human side until it completely took over.
And there's one last detail that can't go unnoticed. His last name, Doom, meaning condemnation. And in the end, it is precisely that intense and blind hatred and resentment that will ultimately condemn him.
Reed, Johnny, and Ben spend the next few days running tests, trying to figure out the source of their powers and how to control them. Johnny discovers that he can heat up so much that he actually manages to fly. Ben finds out that he even has some stone organs inside his body. Sue learns to turn invisible at will and also to launch these powerful waves of energy. The problem is that she goes too far and ends up hitting Reed. Sue jokes, saying, "Please don't think it was because of some grudge I was holding." Reed answers with a hint of bitterness that he has no reason to believe that because she was the one who ended things. One day she simply walked out the door and never came back. The atmosphere turns tense once again.
Sue says she left because she wanted to take the next step, and he kept saying he wasn't ready, so she decided to walk away. Reed replies that it was more complicated than it sounds, to which Sue answers that all she wanted was to share the same apartment with him. She asks him if he felt anything when she left, or if he feels anything now, but Reed can't respond. Johnny interrupts them once again, saying that every time he sets himself on fire, his clothes burn up and leave him just as God brought him into the world. Fortunately, Reed discovers that the blue suits had also been exposed to the same cosmic rays, which means they develop the same properties.
Victor goes to a private doctor who discovers that his cells have an organic metallic composition stronger than steel and diamonds. Half of his arm is already covered in metal, and the doctor, worried about a possible infection, says he must report this to the authorities. Victor asks him not to, hoping to avoid ruining his reputation even further. But when the doctor insists, Victor loses control, grabs him by the neck, and hurls him against the wall with overwhelming force.
Reed begins working on a machine to turn them back to normal, but he warns that a single mistake could double the effects or even kill them. That's why he needs to run the calculations carefully before building it. Meanwhile, the Fantastic Four try to adapt to their new lives. Sue suffers from the constant harassment of paparazzi and fans, overwhelming her. Ben, on the other hand, terrifies everyone around him, feeling rejection and clumsiness with every step he takes. Reed, in contrast, starts enjoying his new powers, which allow him to work without limits.
Johnny is the only one having fun. He takes his Porsche and heads to a motorcycle stunt show. There, he pulls off spectacular jumps, and in one of them, he uses his fiery boost to catch the bike mid-air, almost flying. Even though he ends up crashing, the crowd gives him a standing ovation. Later, he appears on television wearing the suit with the number 4 in an interview that his teammates watch from home. A reporter starts asking him about the superhero nicknames for the team. Johnny answers that he's called the Human Torch, Sue is the Invisible Woman, Reed is Mr. Fantastic, and Ben is the Thing.
He even adds that if they think Ben looks ugly now, he used to look even worse. That's the last straw for the whole team, but especially for Ben, who storms over to Johnny and crushes his car into a ball, leaving it completely useless. Johnny fights back, throwing fireballs at him, but Ben knocks him straight into the lobby with a single punch.
When Sue steps in to stop them, Johnny reminds Ben that he looks like a monster, and that cruel remark makes the stone man walk away in silence.
Johnny and Reed are left arguing. Reed reminds him that these powers are only temporary and that he needs to think before he acts. But Johnny fires back, saying that's exactly Reed's problem, that he never acts without overthinking first. He argues that they have these powers for a reason, finishing with, "This is who we are now. Accept it, or better yet, enjoy it."
Sue tries to calm Ben, apologizing on behalf of her brother for the hurtful words he said. But Ben reminds Sue that Johnny isn't the problem. The problem is the way people look at him with fear, and that's not how he wants to live. Finally, he says he would give anything to be invisible.
Meanwhile, Victor Doom begins plotting his revenge against the team. He discovers that he can control electricity, and he tracks down the banker who withdrew support from him. In a parking garage, he strikes him with a bolt of lightning that pierces straight through his chest. Sometime later, he storms into his own offices to steal weapons, heat-seeking missiles, and massive amounts of liquid nitrogen.
At night, Ben tries to go have a drink at a bar, but the moment he walks in, everyone stares at him with morbid curiosity. He tries to sit down, but his massive weight breaks the stool, causing everyone to laugh at him. Everyone except for a blind woman named Alicia. She offers him a drink, but when Ben tries to hold the glass, it shatters in his hands. That's when he mutters, "If there's a God, he hates me." Alicia replies, "It's not him, it's her," and she doesn't hate. Ben answers that if she could see him, she wouldn't think the same. In response, Alicia says, "Then I'll see you," as she stands up and gently touches his body and his face with her hands. The girl tells him, "Being different isn't always a bad thing." She gives him a warm smile and kindly says goodbye before leaving the bar. In the scene where Ben met Alicia, there was a very powerful moment. He told her that if she could see him, she wouldn't think the same of him. And she replied, "Then let me see." And she did, but in a different way, by getting closer, speaking to him, and touching him. That gesture carries a lot of symbolism because it proposes another way of looking at someone.
Alicia, being blind, doesn't perceive what everyone else sees, the superficial part. She doesn't see the deformed stone monster he has become. She sees beyond that. She sees the person, a man carrying a difficult condition, but who is still, at his core, a human being worthy of respect and value.
Not everyone has that ability. We live in a world where the immediate often outweighs the essence, where, as Galliano said, the package matters more than the content, and where we often only see the superficial. But gestures like Alicia's remind us that there are ways to meet others without prejudice, with acceptance.
What happened to Ben, seeing how people he thought were important pulled away from him after his transformation, was a crushing blow. Yet over time, that pain can turn into a kind of filter, clearing out relationships that weren't nourishing and forcing him to recognize which bonds truly hold.
In the end, the ties that matter are the ones that stay with you for everything you are, not just for one part. Those are the solid bonds, the ones that nurture and accompany. And even if it's hard for him to see it now, sooner or later, Ben will have to come to that realization. From Victor's office, he watches the secret cameras he has installed in Reed's lab. He tells himself that Reed has gotten what he wanted and that he did it by taking it from him, from Victor. However, he says it's now time to get it back, but to do so, he first needs to get rid of his bodyguard, Ben. Victor goes to where Ben is to talk to him, but not to listen or support him, rather to manipulate him. First, he reminds Ben of all he's suffering and how his teammates aren't going through the same struggles. Ben responds that Reed is working hard to fix things, but Victor plants a doubt in his mind. What if instead of working diligently to find a solution, he's just wasting time flirting with Sue?
At the same time, Reed was working so hard on a cure that he even falls asleep at his desk. Then Sue wakes him up to ask what the next test will be, and Reed responds that he's thinking of trying it on himself, although it could be dangerous.
Sue knows he's thinking about these things because he needs a little distraction, so she takes him for a break to a pier where she first asked Reed out many years ago, but makes it clear that she took the initiative. Reed catches the hint and remarks, "Not everyone is as brave as..."
as Victor?" Sue asks. She then clarifies that there is nothing between her and Victor anymore, and that in fact, there never really was. Reed replies that he always thought that's what Sue wanted, a stronger man. Sue responds that yes, she did want a stronger man, but she wanted that man to be Reed. She explains that she didn't tell him at the time because she saw no point, but now that she is telling him, she asks him to take responsibility.
Now, I want to pause on Reed. His case is very particular because deep down, something similar happens to him as it does to Victor, only that his way of facing it has been different.
Reed has also carried the feeling of being less, comparing himself and feeling like a loser next to Victor. This became clear in two moments. First, in that initial conversation with Ben, when Reed said he would never even think of approaching Sue because she was already with a brilliant, successful, and powerful man.
And second, the moment we just saw at the pier, when he acknowledged that Victor was a brave man, as if deep down he believed he himself wasn't. Reed seems to have a deeply ingrained idea of what a man should be, someone with power, money, strength, and status. That's why he let Sue go. It wasn't a lack of love. Everything we've seen in his actions makes it clear that he loves her. What held him back was feeling inadequate, convinced he wasn't enough for what he believed she was looking for. This perspective could also explain how Reed ended up working for Victor. Unconsciously, he believes that's the place he deserves.
And here, perhaps it's also because of this unconscious motivation that he gravitated toward that position. The other major obstacle in Reed, which both Sue and Johnny have pointed out, is his need for control.
In the end, those powers serve as a metaphor for life itself, for everything that arrives unannounced and is beyond our control. And, being calculating does have its advantages.
In the end, those powers serve as a metaphor for life itself, for everything that arrives unexpectedly and is beyond our control. And you see, being calculating does have its benefits. It can help you prepare, protect yourself from stress and some blows, but it also carries its risks. No matter how hard you try, life cannot be controlled. It's unpredictable, and trying to grasp everything will only end up wearing you out. And let's face it, sometimes we have an obsessive side that makes us want to control everything, and when something goes off plan, it's hard to accept. And if we look at Reed from this perspective, his powers take on another meaning too. Precisely to him who has always lived rigidly, life gives him powers that symbolize the exact opposite: flexibility, as if forcing him to learn something he has always struggled with. If Reed wants to grow, he will have to start by working on his insecurity and that feeling of being less than others. But he will also need to learn to let go of some of the calculation and control, daring to take risks that cannot be anticipated, and flowing with whatever comes. After the date with Sue, Reed returns to the apartment and finds Ben waiting for him, full of anger over the doubts Victor planted. He accuses Reed of breaking his promise to restore him to normal. He shouts that he took care of him his whole life for nothing, and now Reed is just enjoying himself while he was left turned into a monster. The argument escalates to blows, but Reed manages to control Ben with his powers. Once Ben calms down, he tells Sue and Reed that they're on their own and leaves. The fight leaves Reed feeling guilty, so determined to help, he tests the machine on himself despite the risk. The attempt fails and nearly melts him. Amidst it, he explains to Sue that what's missing is power. Victor watches everything through his cameras and decides to act. He orders his assistant to summon Ben, calling him a guinea pig. Ben falls and arrives at Reed's laboratory, where only he and Victor are present. There, Victor manipulates him again, lying, telling him that the machine is ready and that if he wants to be Ben again, he should step inside. Ben does so. Victor channels his powers into the machine, and when the process ends, the doors open to reveal that Ben has returned to normal without his rocky appearance, but also without powers. Ben thanks Victor, saying that now he will be able to fix everything, but Victor's seemingly kind expression shifts. He reveals to Ben that all he ever wanted was power, and now he has it in unlimited form. He declares that no one will stand in his way, strikes Ben with brutal force, and exclaims, "3 left."
At that moment, Reed arrives at the scene. Victor boasts that he has created a stronger human being and shouts, "At last, I have defeated the great Reed Richards." He then unleashes a blast that overheats Reed's elastic body, causing him to lose both form and strength. With Reed immobilized, Victor drags him back to his office, but before leaving, he notices a shard of broken glass on the floor. In it, his own reflection stares back at him, a face scarred and twisted, a reminder of what he has become.
This does not please him at all, so he forges a steel mask and places it over his face. Meanwhile, Sue and Johnny stumble upon Ben lying on the ground. Weak, he explains that Victor now possesses powers and has taken Reed captive. At Doom's offices, Victor straps Reed to a chair and begins lowering his body temperature drastically, knowing that when rubber grows too cold, it becomes brittle and easy to shatter.
Afterward, Victor takes a heat-seeking rocket launcher, aims it at the building where Sue and Johnny are, and fires. To stop the missile from destroying the structure, Johnny hurls himself off the rooftop, igniting his powers to propel himself into flight. Sue orders Ben to remain in the lab. Without his abilities, it would be far too dangerous for him to follow. Then, with determination, she runs off to rescue Reed. Johnny manages to lure the missile all the way to an offshore platform, where he ignites it in flames, causing the projectile to explode harmlessly over the sea. Meanwhile, Sue slips invisibly into Victor's office to free Reed. The problem is, Doom notices her presence. She tries to reason with him, but Victor coldly demands that she address him only by his surname, Doom. From there, the fight breaks out. Sue gives it everything she has, but in the end, Doom overpowers her and leaves her defeated. In the scene with the mask, there's a pivotal moment where Victor finally loses the battle against his own rage and allows himself to be completely consumed by it. All of this was symbolized the moment he looked into the broken glass and saw his face already covered in scars. What he really saw there, beyond the physical wounds, was his own self-image shattered. The reflection was broken, and so was he.
These scars, as I suggested earlier, can be seen symbolically as wounds to his very self.
They can be read as the point where his self becomes completely damaged. The grandiose image he had built to protect his fragile self crumbled, and what was left exposed was that vulnerable part he had always tried to hide. That is why he put the mask back on.
In reality, the masks had always been there, even if invisible. The mask of money, the mask of control, and the mask of his successful company. For years, he hid behind them to avoid feeling so small. But when all of that collapsed and he no longer had anything to cover himself with, the mask became literal.
Later, when Sue called him Victor, he corrected her. "I'm no longer Victor. Now I'm Doom." It was a very symbolic moment as well, because there is nothing left of the man he once was. His body is now covered in metal, and that new name, Doom, says it all. Hatred and resentment consumed him so completely that he no longer recognized himself. All that remains is the very doom he built for himself. At this point, he is more powerful than ever, and it seems like the end. But Ben has other plans. Suddenly, he bursts through the wall, transformed once again into the Thing. He lands a brutal blow on Doom, leaving him unconscious and rescuing his friends. It's not that he can control this state at will, but he chose to go back into the machine to regain his powers once more.
But the calm doesn't last long as Doom recovers, lunges at the Thing, and takes the fight to the street. There, Sue, Reed, and Johnny catch up. The Fantastic Four join forces to face him, but Doom puts up a fight. He's strong and made of metal. Fortunately, Reed knows a lot about science and instructs Johnny to wrap Doom in his flames to heat him, Sue to contain him, and once Doom is about to melt, the Thing smashes a fire hydrant to suddenly lower his temperature.
And what happens to steel when it's cooled this way? It becomes rigid. That's how the Fantastic Four managed to stop Victor Doom. The crowd applauds, and the four couldn't be prouder of their new accomplishment.
The scene where Ben decided to transform again to return to the battle struck me as very powerful.
I think in that moment, he realized everything we've been talking about, what relationships truly matter. And one of the most important for him is Reed. That's why he made the difficult decision to become the Thing again, fully aware of what it meant for him. But he did it to save someone who has stood by his side for years, through thick and thin.
However, in that decision, there was something more. It was as if Ben finally understood that his worth didn't depend on his form, that the people who truly matter would care for and appreciate him regardless of whether he had a rocky body or a human one. That's why, in that moment, he stopped fighting against who he was and stopped caring about being or not being the thing. Reed had been there for him before the transformation, after it, and even when everything seemed lost. And now, by choosing to return to his rocky form, Ben returned that act of loyalty.
That's what defines genuine bonds. They aren't based on usefulness or appearances, but on the sincere desire for the other person to be well for who they truly are. In the end, the bonds that really hold are the ones that don't stay on the surface. They don't depend on what anyone can see. They are the ones that, beyond appearances, know how to see what truly matters, who you are, what you give, and what you receive when everything else falls apart. Those are the bonds worth keeping.
A few days later, we see them organizing a party. There, Reed tells Ben that if he makes a couple of adjustments to the machine, he could return him to his human form. But Ben tells him to forget it, that he's fine as he is. Alicia shows up at the party, and the two flirt.
Reed speaks privately with Sue. There, he takes out a ring and tells her that the calculations and overthinking are over. Then he declares, "Sue, will you marry me?" She turns invisible, and Reed, unsure if his hand is in the right place, slides the ring on and it stays there. Sue brings her hand closer, says yes, and they finally share a kiss. Reed's two major conflicts found their resolution in this final scene.
On one hand, we saw how he began to feel more self-confident. He dared to take the step because he understood that he, just as he was, had something valuable to offer. He no longer measured himself by Victor's standards of success, nor felt inferior for not fitting that mold. And the other point was in the way he gave Sue the ring.
Reed had no way of knowing if her finger would be there waiting for him, or if, invisible, she would pull away. There was no certainty that things would turn out the way he wanted. But still, he took the risk. He reached out without guarantees and trusted. In that moment, it became clear that he had learned to let go of control a little and take a leap, even when there was no certainty about what would happen. Thus, a man who had spent his whole life trying to control everything, he ended up using the power of elasticity, not just in the literal sense with his body, but also in the emotional one. At last, he allowed himself to be flexible, to embrace change, to set aside the excess of calculation, and to open himself up to the unpredictable.
I think Reed's true victory was realizing that life isn't solved like an equation, that sometimes you have to take a leap without guarantees. And even though that means risking failure, it also frees you from the paralysis that fear creates.